How many of you would say, no, we're not required? It's grace giving. How many of you say, I'm going to hold my vote to the end? Okay, so all right. Well, look at this. Are we required to tithe? There are people out there who are adamant on both sides. Generally, the one who is adamant on tithing, that it's required, are the church leadership, right? And they will preach that. And I know I've heard many people tell me that churches will not do funerals if tithing records have not been updated. So you're talking, and this is not just like any kind of denomination. You're talking this is major denominational stories. I've heard people not allowed to serve in ministries at all unless they have an up-to-date tithe record. And you go down the list. So this is generally, that side has been held, if you will, from church leadership perspective. Then you have the other side, adamant, no, we give under grace, and they don't give it all. And America's, as I mentioned this last week, America's giving report is under 2%. America gives, think about that, under 2% of their wealth. Period. Not even to the Lord, just period. 2%. Okay? So we're going to be looking at what is the tithe, and we started looking at it last week a little bit, and I'm going to look at it today in detail. Genesis chapter 14, I shouldn't say detail, it's not going to be like a dissertation or anything, but Genesis 14 establishes a point that I want everyone to notice, and I'm not going to stay on this point long, but it's something that I should bring out in Genesis chapter 14. There's a story here in the Bible where Abraham's nephew, Lot, was captured. And Abraham gets his band of armies together, and he goes down and he captures the people who captured his nephew Lot. And he's coming back, and when he is on his way back, he's confronted by Melchizedek. In verse number 18, it says, "And Melchizedek, king of Salem," that's ancient Jerusalem, "brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave him tithes of all." This is one simple point that I'm going to bring out here, and it happens again in the life of Jacob, Abraham's grandson. But we see here somebody giving a tithe to the priest of the Most High God, and that tithe means 10%. The reason why I'm bringing this particular Old Testament passage out, this is the first time we see it, is because, not only is it the first time we see it, but also because it's before the law. You have to understand that argument, so to speak. That the very first time we ever see tithing, it was what? It was volunteer. It was voluntary. And it was before the law, before it was required. So the very first instance ever that we have, and the law first mentioned, is definitely something to take into consideration. The very first thing that you ever have is Abraham tithing to Melchizedek. And by the way, that tithe is mentioned in the book of Hebrews in a couple places. So he's kind of bringing this out. He was like, hey, the person who tithed, he tithed to the greater. You have to also understand the purpose of the tithe. Why did Abraham tithe? I didn't go deep into the story. We kind of splashed into the pool without me going into detail into the story. But if you know the story at least, offhand, was Abraham being punished? Was he getting taxed 10%? Abraham wasn't. He had just won a battle. He had just, gone and defeated the enemy, and he captured or recaptured his nephew back along with all the possessions that he had, Lot. So was Abraham being punished? The answer is no. Was he being taxed by God? No. What was Abraham doing? Give you guys a second to dust.
Yeah.
What was Abraham doing by tithing? By giving to Melchizedek. What was Abraham saying?
He was grateful.
He was grateful. That's exactly what he was saying. Blessed. He was blessed. Melchizedek just came over here and blessed Abraham. And he's being the priest of the Most High God. So this is God blessing Abraham. And Abraham responds to God's blessing with a tithe. And he gives him 10%. And to make this story a little bit even more interesting, guess who also meets Abraham? Not only the king of Salem, Melchizedek, but the king of Sodom also meets Abraham. And the king of Sodom offers Abraham all kinds of stuff. And Abraham says, I ain't taking a single thing, lest it be said that the king of Sodom made me rich. So, kind of interesting story to see you have the king of Sodom and the king of Salem, and Abraham rejects all of the king of Sodom, and he gives a tithe to the king of Salem, the priest of the Most High God. So keeping that story as the foundation of tithing will help us understand the purpose of a tithe. The tithe was before the law. It was established here by Abraham in response of gratitude towards God. It was shown to be an example, or it was shown to be a response to blessing. That's what a tithe was. It was a response to blessing. Okay? Very similar to me if I were to say, Willie, I'm buying you a pizza party. And Willie says, oh, Pastor Tom, you're the best. Here. And he opens up my box of pizza. He goes, take a slice. What is he doing? He's giving me back something that's mine in a response of gratitude for what was given. Okay? That essentially is the tithe in a nutshell. Again, we see this in the story of Jacob. For sake of time, I don't want to go into that story. But basically, Jacob was on the run from his brother Esau. He gets to the place where he puts his head on the rock. He has the dream, Jacob's ladder. The angels ascending and descending. And basically, he vows a vow unto God, and he says, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God, and this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the 10th unto thee. So what does Jacob do? He basically says, man, if God blesses me, I will tithe. That was his response. And again, this is Abraham's grandson. This is hundreds of years, over 400 years, because we know that captivity in Egypt was 400 years. So this is over 400 years before the law was ever given. Abraham gave a tithe because he was blessed, and Jacob basically says, all right, God, if you bless me, if you feed me, if you keep me, then I'll tithe to you. God, I'll give you 10% back of whatever you give me. I mean, this is the two instances that we have of tithing before the law. So people who want to go along the idea of we don't tithe because that's the law, and we don't live under the law anymore, we live under grace, they kind of lose their argument to me. because this was pre-law. If all we did was see this in the Old Testament law, then I would say, well, you have a point. But we don't. We see this pre-law, and we see tithing as a response to blessing, which, if you jump into the New Testament, one of the requirements of giving is cheerful giving. Now you understand. It's being equated. The tithe was a cheerful response to the blessings of the Lord. Okay? Now, let's jump into the law, and let's look at what the actual Old Testament tithe was, because for all of the people on the other side of the fence, the ones who take the tithe and beat Dave over the head and grab him by the feet, hang him upside down like a deer, shake all the money out of his pocket into the offering plate and say, did you tithe? Let's look at that aspect of it, because the argument there is, well, you're trying to preach an Old Testament practice as though we're supposed to follow Old Testament law. But let's look at what the Old Testament law of tithing was. Okay? Now, you have to understand a little bit about how God worked. Give a little historical context here. When God gave the promised land to the Israelites, he divided up the land by tribes. Okay? And in essence, there were 12 tribes. Okay? And he gave each one of the tribes, he gave each one of the tribes a portion of land. But the tribe of Levi, he did not give a portion of land to. The tribe of Levi, God says, I will be your inheritance. That's a really interesting study, and you'll understand it when you study it out in detail. So all throughout the coast of Israel, this section, it was kind of like states in the United States. You have the state of, Gad, the state of Dan. You have all these 12 tribes except for Levi. Levi didn't have any land. No different than if I were to divide up, this room and say, okay, Willie, you get, 2 tables. Dave, you get 2 tables, and I break everything up here, and I say, except for Jim. Jim, you get no area. Everybody in this room is to share with Jim a portion of their land. That is what the tithe was. So what happened was the Levites were to be dispersed throughout the people, and they lived among the people, and then they were all divided. There was different ranks in the Levites, and the Levites' job was to be worship. They were the ones to work in the tabernacle, then later on they were to work in the temple. Okay? And they were to be the ones who offered the morning sacrifice, the evening sacrifice. They did all the festivals. They did they would do all of the trumpets, the choirs. We see all the different songs that were written inside here. And there was rotations, because there was all kinds of things that had to be done. And when you consider the Old Testament sacrificial system, the law, the Mosaic law, how many sacrifices were there? Thousands. Thousands and thousands. Dave and Willie are here. Gary's here. You guys know how, you guys kill a deer, you have to do what? You got to field dress it. You got to cut it. You got to skin it. You got to do all this other stuff with it. Well, can you imagine? Can you imagine if Willie and Dave and Gary were the Levites among us, and all of us brought in one animal tonight for a sacrifice? So here comes the Wrights. They bring in a bullock. Here comes Tom and Holly. We bring in a lamb. Here comes the Tomes. They bring in a goat. For all these different, and there's all kinds of different sacrifices. Gary, Dave, and Willie, how busy would you be?
Too busy.
Yeah, you guys would be busy. You have to cut. Not only would you have to do the actual field dressing, but you'd have to do the actual sacrificing. You'd have to do the sprinkling of the blood. You'd have to be going into the holy place, stopping by the laver, washing your hands, going inside, sprinkling the blood here, eating the wafers, coming back out, washing back in the laver, coming back over here. How much blood would be around these things? It was a bloody place. So consider that. That was the Levites' portion. Okay? So the Levites were commanded by God to be fed by the people of God. And that is what the tithe was when it was instituted. Okay, so basically God was saying, Gary, Dave, Willie, you're going to be working like crazy, and you're not going to have any place of your own. You're not going to have your own fields. You're not going to have your own houses. You're not going to have you're going to be living in the midst of everybody, okay? But Jim, Mr. Wright, Tom, guys, take care of these guys who are working among you. You make sure that they're not hungry. You know, Jim, you got a nice big giant field over there. Make sure Willie gets a spot to hunt because he doesn't have any land. Right? He's basically telling the people of Israel to care for the Levites who were serving the Lord. So that is what the tithe was. Okay? It was a 10% of all that they had. Now, what's interesting is if you look at Numbers chapter number 18, did you guys turn there? Numbers chapter 18 and verse number 2. Numbers 18 and verse number 2. Says, and the brethren also of the tribe of Levi, the tribe of thy father, bring thou with thee, that they may be joined unto thee and minister unto thee. That's not the one I want. Okay. I'm in the right chapter. I think I'm missing the one verse that I want. Verse 3, and they shall keep thy charge and the charge of all thy tabernacle. Only they shall not come nigh the vessels of the sanctuary in the altar, that neither they nor ye also die. And they shall be joined unto thee, and keep the charge of the tabernacle of the congregation for all the service of the tabernacle, and a stranger shall not come nigh unto you, and ye shall keep the charge of the sanctuary and the charge of the altar, that there be no wrath any more upon the children of Israel. This is essentially the passage that's talking about the Levites being given charge of the sanctuary. So these were the people who were to be doing the offerings. I couldn't just jump in and say, well, you know, Willie, I'll go do my own sacrifice. God was saying, no, I've given the Levites charge over this. Verse 6, and I, behold, I have taken your brethren, the Levites, from among you, the children of Israel. To you they are given as a gift for the Lord, to do the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. Again, the Levites were to be seen as a blessing. They were to be seen as a gift that God instituted these people to take care of the people of take care of all the sacrificial things that God wanted them to do. Okay, so I'll skip ahead in my notes. I jumped ahead, which is why I'm a little bit lost now, and I'm looking at my phone trying to find it where it is. God instituted the Levites to do the work of the service. We were not allowed to do it. Only the Levites were allowed to do it, and therefore God instituted the tithe to care for the people of the Lord. What was included in the Old Testament tithe? This is where basically the book of Leviticus. You'll see some other places like Deuteronomy and other places, but the book of Leviticus is where you're going to get the most laid out order, okay, of instruction. Leviticus chapter 27 and verse number 30. This is where the tithe is mentioned. 27 verse 30. Says, and all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord. And if a man will at all redeem all his tithes, he shall add thereto the fifth part thereof, and concerning the tithe of the herd or the flock, even of whatsoever passeth under the rod, the tenth shall be holy unto the Lord. Okay, so right here you have, in a nutshell, what the tithe was. Okay, 10% of produce, verse 30, whether that is of seed or of fruit. Okay, or livestock, verse 32. So every 10th lamb that was born belonged to who? Belonged to the Lord, and it was given to the Levites. So let's just make this easy for illustration. So Willie, you have the beard. Okay, so you are the Levite here. Dave, you have one too, so you can be one if you want. But we got our Levite over there, right? So here we all are. We're the common people. He's the Levites. We all have land. We all have houses. We've all got livestock. He doesn't. Willie doesn't, and so we bring in our tithe. Every 10th apple off the apple tree was whose? The Lord's. And it was given to who? The Levites. So you pick 10 apples, one apple goes where? To Willie. There you go. One apple goes to Willie. So let's count how many people we got here. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 adults. 1, 2, 3. We'll say households. 1, 2, because this was by household. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because you're part of my household. Okay, so we got 6 households here in the room. Okay, not including the Levites. So we'd pick 10 apples, 10 apples, 10 apples, 10 apples, 10 apples, 10 apples, and every one of us would bring 1 apple to the Levite. So Willie would have how many apples? He would have 6. We would have 9. Okay? Very simple. This is where it's interesting because the Bible, back in the Old Testament times, underneath the law, God actually wanted you to actually give the product, not money. He gives a variance in verse number 31. He says, if a man will at all redeem aught of his tithes, he shall add thereto the 5th part thereof. What he's saying here, and this is an interesting part of the study that I had, is he wants you to give the apple. He wants you to give the 10th lamb. However, if you needed to redeem that for whatever reason, life circumstances, and you were unable to make it before the apple rotted or whatever, life circumstance take place, and you had to sell your produce or you had to sell your livestock, then you had to give the value of that plus 20%, a 5th part. So to make it easy, if the lamb's value was $10, you can't just sell that lamb and give the $10 to Willie. You had to sell the lamb, $10, and you had to add a 5th part to it. So you'd have to add $2 more additionally. And so you would give Willie $12. So if you had to sell it and give money, the tithe was actually a lot more than a tithe. It was a tithe plus 20%. Take that, preachers. Okay, now you got some ammunition now, man. All you people who give money to the church, shame on you. You should be adding 20% to your tithe, right? So this is interesting, though. I mean, at the end of the day, the tithe was actually things. It was products. It was if you harvested bushels of apples, you were giving apples. If you harvested corn, you were actually bringing in the food. If you raised crop or raised animals, you were giving the animals. And if you had to sell for whatever reason, you had to add 20% of the value to that tithe to bring in. Any comments on this or questions? Holly?
I have just some clear. Sell the lamb for 10, then bring 10 to Willie, not 1 plus 2.
So if you let's say that I raised 10 lambs, okay? If I had 10 lambs, each one of them are worth $10 each. So I had to sell.
Okay, sorry, I didn't hear the 10 lamb part.
Sell the whole lot.
So, yeah.
No,
Oh, no.
no, it doesn't matter. I'm just clarifying it.
10% of
So if I had to give a lamb, let's say I had 10 lambs, and I had to give my 10th lamb as a tithe. But for whatever reason, I sold the lamb so that I could give the value of the lamb to Willie. If I sold my tithe, I had to add 20% of the value to it to give it, a fifth part. Any other questions? How many of you did not know that? I was surprised too when I was studying. I'm like, oh, that's pretty interesting. Man, our church giving should go up big time now. Willie's gonna be like, not me. I'm gonna start tithing trees, man. He's gonna start we're having trees out in our parking lot. He's like, I'm saving money, man. Yeah, we're gonna have all kinds of stuff, man. Okay. So that is how the tithe worked. Now, in addition to the regular tithe or this normal annual tithe, because they would give annually, there were 2 other tithes. The first tithe that they gave was called the festival tithe, and the festival tithe was done annually additionally. And that was an additional 10% of produce. And that was to be brought in during the festival seasons, because there was different festivals. The Day of Atonement, the Feast of Tabernacles. So on these special days, people were required to bring in an additional 10%. And when they brought that 10% in, they were to give that to the Levites as well, and they could actually participate in that offering themselves. So, for instance, if I gave that tithe, when I gave that tithe, not if, when I gave that tithe, I would actually take 10% and make a meal and enjoy it with the priest. Okay? So I participated in that offering. It wasn't the annual tithe I brought in, that was the Lord's. The festival tithe, which was an additional 10%. Now, how about this, guys? Starting to do some math, quick math, real quick. 10% normal tithe, 10% festival tithe. How many apples were supposed to be the Lord's? How many apples out of 10 were supposed to be the Lord's? 2. The Old Testament tithe actually was 20% of produce, but you did not have to give 10% of your livestock. There's no requirement for that. So if you could keep your more animals, I guess you can say. Okay, but the festival tithe, it was to be brought in, and I would share that. So in other words, I would have Levi or Willie over to my house, and we would celebrate the goodness of the Lord. We see this particularly listed out in Deuteronomy chapter number 14 and verse number 22. If you want to go there just briefly. Again, the the Old Testament is a little bit hard because you jump around, you see all these different places, and it's hard to follow. It's not like there's just listed out one time.
What did you say?
Deuteronomy chapter number 14 and verse number 22. Thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed, and that the field bringeth forth year by year, and thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there, the tithe of thy corn and of thy wine and of thy oil, and the firstlings of thy flocks. Oh man, I was wrong there. And the firstlings of thy herds and of thy flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always. And if the way be too long for thee, so that thou art not able to carry it, or if the place be too far from thee, which the Lord thy God shall choose to set his name there, when the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, then thou shalt turn it into money, and bind up the money in thine hand, and shalt go unto the place which the Lord thy God shall choose, and thou shalt bestow that money for whatsoever thy soul lusteth after, for oxen, or for sheep, or for wine, or for strong drink, or for whatsoever thy soul desireth. And thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice, thou and thine household, and the Levite that is within thy gates, thou shalt not forsake him, for he hath no part nor inheritance with thee. Okay, so I was wrong. It does include the livestock and the herds. Okay, so you have a second additional tithe, and this tithe was to be given annually, but this one was to be shared in. This one you were to not only spend it, but you were to also include Willie, and you were to enjoy the blessings of the Lord there. And then the last tithe was the charity tithe. And the charity tithe is found in verse 28 through 29 there in the same chapter. It says, At the end of 3 years shalt thou bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and shalt lay it up within thy gates, and the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hand which thou doest. This one was to be, this tithe was every 3 years, and you were to bring in this charity tithe, and it does not seem as though it replaces the festival tithe. So it seems as though every third year your tithe went from 20% to 30%. And this one was to be stored in your local gates, within thy gates, it says in verse 28. Lay it up within thy gates. In other words, every community was to have some kind of storehouse, and that tithe was meant for who? What's that? The widows, the poor. So in many commentators, they call it the poor tithe. So this one was to care for all the people who are down and out. It's the benevolent fund, right? It was the fund where, oh, so-and-so just lost his job. We need to contribute to them. Well, there you have it. There's the Old Testament tithe. Now,
what would that be considered today? What would you say? Charity?
so are you saying the charity tithe?
Yeah. It's all going through the church, or not through the church, but through the Levites.
So in this one, the Levite gets a portion of the charity tithe. Verse 29 says, and the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates. So the charity tithe, the poor tithe, the Levite would get a portion of that, but it also included would be...
I guess I'm saying as a community.
Yeah, it's kind of like the nonprofit of the ancient old days, right? And that was only every 3 years. So you had 3 tithes. You had the normal tithe that was brought to the temple, that was given annually, and you were to give produce, animals. But if you had to convert it to money, you had to add a 5th part to it. That was the normal tithe. Then you had the festival tithe, and that was produce and livestock. That was for you to share in the blessings of God and invite your Levites with you, particularly your local Levites. But if for some reason you could not go to the place that God had destined for that time being, and you had to sell it, you could sell your money, sell your things for money, and then you can get to the place where you were going to be, and then you could buy whatever your soul lusteth after, and then share it with the Levites. Okay? And it's kind of interesting. Whenever it talks about the tithe and it mentions the Levites, it always says because they have no inheritance from the Lord. In other words, your tithe is their inheritance. So you better not be stealing from the Levites. That's what these passages are saying. And then the third tithe is the charity tithe. So now, after just hearing a brief synopsis, and to be honest with you, that's about all of the verses on tithing as far as instructions that we have in the scriptures. You can search, maybe find little things here and there. Hebrews mentions these tithes. Go back to my original question. Are we required to tithe today? And for all of you who grew up hearing you must tithe, have you heard the correct teaching on how we should tithe? And the answer is no. And then for the other side who says, we're grace giving, well, have you ever heard them defend the use of the tithe? No, they want to erase the tithe from the scriptures. And what you're going to see when we get into New Testament giving is we are not bound, that is true, by Old Testament laws. That was written for the ancient Israelite people. But inside those laws are principles. And what are those principles? Well, there's all kinds of principles that we have from here. Number one, tithes established before the law were meant to be responses of gratitude. So the tithe is not to be discarded and looked down upon. It was actually meant to be, hey, Willie, if God blesses you, you ought to tithe. That's not a law that you have to follow. It's a principle that we should be following. Dave?
Well, I've heard it argued, I can't remember where I heard it from, but somewhere they were talking about tithes. And one of the arguments I heard against it, they said, well, that was for the Jews. We're not Jews.
Right.
Basically, is what it come down. That was their argument.
Sure. But keep in mind that Abraham and Jacob weren't Jews either.
That's true.
Okay? Abraham was the first Hebrew. Hebrew means immigrant. So Abraham is the father of us all because he was both a Gentile and a Jew, right? So God converted him, so to speak. But the nation of Israel was not established as a nation until, I don't know, I guess God changed Jacob's name to Israel, so he also would have been the first Israelite, So here's the lesson, and I'm going to give you guys something that I started a couple of years ago. We're going to cover now New Testament giving down the road. I'm excited about that because we are under grace. But what you're going to find is that being under grace actually has more requirements. That's what you're going to find. Remember, Jesus says, you have heard, you should not kill. But I say unto you, don't, hate somebody. You have heard, don't commit adultery. But I say, don't lust after somebody. Ye have heard, and it goes down the list. It says all these different things, and it's like, the law was down here, grace was up here. So if you want to start recognizing giving underneath this context, tithing's down here. Tithing's the foundation. Tithing's our starting point. And it's meant to be in response of gratitude. But we are to grow in the grace of giving. Remember, the Apostle Paul says that in 1 Corinthians. We're to grow in this grace of giving. For those of you who grew up in church, I look at Esther, right? Ella, what'd she say?
I said I had a quick question.
Oh, go ahead.
About this reason. So where does Malachi 3 fit into this then?
So
He's saying you're robbing God. So I understand like the beginning, but then how do we get from it's a heart issue to God specifically saying, or Malachi specifically saying, you're robbing God in tithes and offerings? So he's very specific there. So the connotation of robbing is not, that it's not something that it's a choice. It's like, no, that's God's, and you're stealing it from him if you keep it. So where does that breakdown happen to where at the end of the Old Testament that's what is being said here?
Sure. So Malachi was still Old Testament. So they were under the law at that point, and they were breaking the law. They were not giving underneath that law, and therefore they were robbing God. Okay? But notice, he didn't just say that you're robbing God in your tithes. He said you're robbing God with your tithes and offerings. You see, in addition to the tithe, and I didn't get into that, in addition to the tithe, they were also instructed on what to do if they wanted to bring offerings. And they had, if they wanted to bring offerings, offerings are free will. They had specific requirements for offerings, though. And there was actually different times where collections were taken, like when they wanted to build the laver, the ladies donated all of their, looking glasses. And then when they built the temple, they donated all of that. And then when they wanted to have a revival, you'll see different collections at all these different times that were taken. So we do see free will offerings instituted as well. So the principle is this. If we are not giving back to God what God has blessed us with, we are definitely robbing God. And tithes are not the only area in which we are robbing God. So the Old Testament Israelite that Malachi was talking to, they were under the Mosaic law. They had to give that tithe, but they did not have to give the offering, but they were still robbing in both. And in the New Testament, we are no longer under the law, so we are not necessarily mandatorily having to give a tithe to the Levites, okay? But we still have grace giving. It's seen all throughout the New Testament. We'll get into that down the road. And we are robbing God if we do not give him our tithes and our offerings, undoubtedly. Even though tithing is not required, the giving spirit is required. We see that listed clearly. We are to give sacrificially. We're to give cheerfully. We're to give out of grace. Does that answer your question a little bit? We can expand on this a little bit further as we cover the topic of New Testament giving, because we're going to see how New Testament giving actually has higher requirements even though we're under grace. Okay? But it should never be upon the back of your shoulders that Dave is going to have to put his wife out of the house because he's going to tithe. Or all of a sudden Esther's car breaks down and she can't fix her car because she has to tithe and she has no money left over. Or, does that make sense? Willie's out of a job and Danica goes and cleans, a house to scrape by, and, they feel bad because they have to give. It should never be that way. In fact, we're going to get into that sooner than later. But I'll tell you this. This is something that we instituted 2 years ago, and we based it off of this Old Testament principle, and I'm going to encourage you to do this. Tithing was meant to be a blessing, and I hope that you guys learn to give out of gratitude. Okay, that's one of the major principles that I want to share with you here today. I hope that when I preach on tithing or giving, if you will, I think we call it tithe out of habit, and there's nothing wrong with calling it a tithe, even though, Moses required it, Abraham wasn't. So, and it was called tithe all throughout, and Hebrews mentions it as well. But I hope Gary gives out of his a heart that has been blessed. When I preach on tithing, I want Kelsey and Jeremiah to be excited about what they give. Does that make sense? You ought to praise the Lord for the blessing. That is probably the number one lesson of tithing. It ought to be from a heart of gratitude. It's from the blessings of the Lord. But last year, when I first came across this principle, or 2 years ago, when I first came across this principle and I started studying this out, it was recommended in a book, and I ended up doing it. It's been the best thing ever. But I kind of took the principle of, because I never gave that, I shouldn't say I never gave that additional tithe. I think all of us have given not only the tithe, but if you've grown in giving, you give more than the tithe, okay? I remember back in the days when Holly and I were young and we were getting, we were tight, and it was like every time we got tighter, we raised our givings, and I don't regret those years at all. I don't do the same things that I did then now all the time. But I remember at one point, I think we were given like up to 25% of our income, and we were in debt, trying to get ourselves out of debt. You know, I would counsel you differently today than I was then. But I don't regret those days. I remember giving, and I remember giving big during those days. But I also remember during those days that we were giving big, that we defrauded our own family. You know, I hurt Holly. Holly didn't have pleasures, simple things, you know, while we were given to God. Does that make sense? Here we are sacrificing, given to God, but the family was struggling and hurting, and we were living with the heat at 55 degrees, and you know, we still do that. Okay, but no, not really. But you know, that's the concept. And when I came across the second tithe of charity tithe, or the festival tithe, excuse me, when I came across the festival tithe, it kind of made me pause, and it kind of made me think, like, man, I give to the Lord that 10%. I don't touch that. That's the Lord's. But then all of us give, and we like to give. And so what we ended up doing was the festival tithe. It was meant to you enjoy the blessing of the Lord. You take you know, let's say you make $100. You give $10 to the church. That's the Lord's. It's His. And then you take $10 and have we instituted it. We call it the blessings dinner. And we do it once a year, and I encourage all of you to do it. Where you take your tithe, and we store it up. Believe me, we store it up all year long, and we look forward to it. And then we go out to whatever restaurant you want. You name it. I don't care how expensive it is, and believe me, man, I'm like, Ella, where do you want to go? Ruth Chris! Okay. And we do. We go out to whatever restaurant we want. This is once a year. We do it. We generally do it in January, although we don't have like a law of it, you know. And what do we do? Ella, what do we do? Well, food-wise? You can order whatever you want. Appetizers, drinks, full-course meals, desserts. We went to Cashtown Inn the last time. I got done. They all ordered the sweatshirts and the T-shirts there. You know, it was just a wonderful night. And we have one rule, and one rule only, because the festival tithe was to recount the blessings of God. And you were to share it, and you were to enjoy it. And so we have one rule, and that was, Ella? Recount the blessings of God. So the whole evening, every year, all we do is talk about the goodness of God. And we go through and we're like, oh yeah, remember the church gave us that Christmas present? Wasn't that great? Oh yeah. You know, oh, remember when Mr. Willie and Miss Danica took us out to the car show? Wasn't that fun? That was fun. That was a blessing. Oh, remember Mr. Gary gave us that meat? Oh, that was a blessing. Remember Dave let us go hunting? Oh, that was a blessing. Oh, remember Miss Kelsey wrote that little note to you? That was a blessing. Remember when Jim dropped off a few dollars for your birthday? That was a blessing. And all we do the entire evening is recount the blessings of God. We've done that two times now based off of this principle, and it has radically transformed our giving. I would encourage you to do it on an annual basis at least. I told Holly, I said, I enjoy this so much, I might do this twice a year. You know, but there's no limit because it's God's. And what it does is it makes you, you know, look at verse 26. It says of Deuteronomy 14. It says, and thou shalt bestow that money. Okay, verse 25. It says, well, I'll go back to 24. And if the way be too long for thee, so that thou art not able to carry it, or if the place be too far from thee, which the Lord thy God shall choose to set his name there, when the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, then thou shalt turn it into money, and bind up the money in thine hand, and shalt go unto the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. And thou shalt bestow that money for whatsoever thy soul lusteth after. That's where we get that idea from. Like, hey, no holding back. Turn it into money and buy whatever you want, for oxen, for sheep, for wine, for strong drink, for whatsoever thy soul desireth, and thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice, thou and thine household, and the Levite that is within thy gates, thou shalt not forsake him. So for us, it's easy. I am the pastor, so I didn't have to invite the pastor along, but you guys should. No, I'm joking. Every one of you. Okay. But I took this principle and we've applied it the last 2 years, and we've taken our family out, and we really have. I forget the first year we went to what's that place? John Wright Restaurant, and then the second year we went to Cashtown Inn, and this year we haven't decided where we're going to go. And all we did is we buy whatever you want, and you enjoy that evening, and you just rejoice over the blessings that God has given. And I'm telling you, it puts a refreshing view on giving. It puts a tremendous refreshing view on giving. And I would encourage you to do that. I would encourage you to take that time and do this annually on a regular basis. Again, it's not a law. You don't have to do this. This is just a principle taken off of just like we give our modern day tithes and offerings off of the principle of tithing in the Old Testament. Here's a principle that you have the festival tithe where you rejoice that God has been good to you. And then the third principle of giving, that poor tithe or the charity tithe, is when you see people in need. That is the benevolent fund. That's where you give extra money to people who are down and out, people who are hurting, people who need a little extra. And so you're sitting there and you're not counting 10%, 20%, 30%. You're giving. Okay? So the blessings, we call it the blessings night, the blessings dinner. And we look forward to that. Hope you guys could enjoy that. I was looking forward to teaching this entire series, and you guys might come back and say, man, that was one of the best lessons all year, right? Now that you get to buy whatever your soul lusteth after, and enjoy that. Okay? That's just like, man, we should have started this when I was a kid. She's like, Dad, we got makeup, all right? She's counting it right now. She's already going through it all and everything, man. Oh. Dave, why don't you close in a prayer and we'll be dismissed.
Okay, for allowing us to come together again and to hear from your word. We ask now that you would help us all, Lord, to use our finances wisely, because there's so many things in the world that entice us to give here or give there. Give us the wisdom and guidance that we need. We just pray that you be with us in days which lie ahead, and today you would take us home. For I pray this in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. I will see you on Tuesday evening, so may the Lord bless you.